So before we kick off today's panel, I'm going to ask Willie Foote, founder of Root Capital and a dear friend, to get up and frame a whole, this conversation. And I will say that the assembled group of people on this stage, and Willie will say a little bit more about this endeavor, represents some of the most innovative, award-winningest, as they say in America, entrepreneurial, impressive people than you can possibly imagine. So we are very privileged to be in their midst, in my opinion. And this coalition is going to do something, I think, if it succeeds, that's really, really, really interesting. So Willie is going to give some context for the conversation, and then we're going to take a deep dive with this august and interesting panel. Willie.
I hope you don't mind, I'm going to put my back to you. So yeah, I'm Willie Foote. It's great to be here. I am the founder and CEO of Root Capital, which invests in and partners with agricultural businesses like farmer cooperatives in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. And so just with respect to tonight's conversation, I want to kick it off by saying in our particular case, as a member of this coalition, we focus on regenerative agroforestry, which is an ancient agricultural technique, and this is in tropical forest regions where we focus mostly. It's an ancient agricultural technique that is being rediscovered in the fight against the nature and climate crises. So agroforestry is the intentional combination of trees with shrubs and crops in order to create a resilient climate that benefits farmers, biodiversity, and the climate. So that's what we do, and we, maybe most importantly today and tonight, is we are a founding, a co-founder and member of the Climate Action for Smallholders Coalition, or CASH Coalition. And if I could ask the members of this CASH Coalition to stand up for just a sec. We spent the past 2 days together. Maybe you can't see it online, but there's a lot of us. And just to say that we are a newly launched collective action platform, the premise of which, behind our findings, that smallholder farmers and local people and indigenous communities must be seen as sustainable land managers, as land stewards. The key, we would argue, to nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. So not just growing crops in the ground, but managing a diverse portfolio of assets that creates critical value for people and planet. So well beyond the crops they grow in the ground in terms of water conservation, soil, healthy soil, forest, standing forest, carbon sequestration, and species diversity. So we as CASH, we believe, members of this coalition, that smallholder farmers must gain the rights and economic recognition to that value, and that smallholder farmers, local people, indigenous communities, forest keepers should be proactively and fairly compensated for that sustainable land management practices and outcomes for the world. So that is not the case right now, and the numbers reflect this of total global climate finance mobilized annually, which is roughly $630 billion or more. 1.7% goes to smallholder farmers, and that is not just a moral failure, it's a massive missed opportunity to direct resources to frontline communities who are best positioned to be those climate action leaders. And so that reflects, among other things, the fact that voluntary carbon markets and payment-free ecosystems markets and climate finance writ large is not aligned today with the reality of smallholder farmers, and that's got to change. Okay, so shifting gears quickly, what distinguishes this CASH coalition that's met here, right here in the Conduit today, and in London since Monday? So what distinguishes us is that all of the organizations are fiercely focused on serving smallholder farmer communities and local people and indigenous populations and so on. So serving those communities that are those land stewards and good carbon actors that the world needs. So we represent different experiences, different approaches, different distribution models, different impact models, but all of us have an asset collectively that's really critical, which is we have long-term trusting relationships with collectively millions and millions of smallholder farmers worldwide. And so we represent a mosaic of interlocking solutions, if you will. And I'd say we bring scale and ethics and rigor and proximity to these challenges at hand. And we are all in global agreement with James Mwangi, who founded Jack's organization, Climate Action Platform Africa, that we need to change the narrative around smallholder farmers from climate victim to climate vanguard. So lastly, how do we come together as a cash coalition? And here I think there's a lot of love in this room around the Skoll Foundation. We are 12 organizations now and growing as founding organizations. 9 of those 12 are actually awardees of the Skoll Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. And so that has really been really critical for creating the enabling conditions for what we like to call pathological collaboration. And my guess is it's the same thing for the Conduit. The conversations and the bonds that are created within these walls and beyond are kind of what has led to the creation of the Cash Coalition early on. And just to say, the timing of this was that we started incubating the Cash Coalition about a year ago when the Skoll World Forum, which as many may know takes place just down the road in Oxford, the face-to-face meeting was canceled. And so there was a Skoll World Forum watch party that some of us helped to organize in Tarrytown, New York, where 140 people actually showed up, and a bunch of us met there. And that's where we really began incubating this conversation. So here we are, fast forward. We have fully launched. I think this week was our 4th face-to-face, full-blown face-to-face meeting. We've had very rigorous, regular calls and connections since then, including, as we said today, the Conduit, making this beautiful space available. I think we had dinner here last night. So I just want to thank Paul again for your friendship and leadership, and Rosie Fletcher, awesome, the whole Conduit team, thank you all for making us so welcome. And again, we are gathered here today, this afternoon, because, and thank you all for joining us here and online. We all believe that smallholder farmers should be at the very heart of nature-based solutions, and they are not today, and that's got to change, and that's what we are going to do with the Cash Coalition and partners and allies. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back to Paul.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Willie. So you can see that was a super easy yes to answer when Willie said, can we meet here and conspire here? What we're going to do in this panel conversation is we're going to take 4 representatives of this coalition. They're going to make brief interventions about what each of their organizations do, and hopefully they're going to do so in a way that links into both Willie's framing, but also the solve, because I think what we're all interested in this room is how this coalition is going to try and solve the problem statement that Willie just articulated. So I'm going to start with Jack. Say a little bit about your organization, about what you're working on, and then we'll work our way down, and then we'll have an informed conversation. Jack.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Kimani. I'm the CEO of the Climate Action Platform for Africa. I really did mention a little bit about that. I was mentioning to Paul the last time I was here was during the New York Times London Climate Week, where this room was only standing room only. And so I had memories of that coming in, thinking we probably have something of a similar turnout, but these are the important people that understand the value of smallholder farmers. So the Climate Action Platform for Africa is a public benefit system orchestrator, field builder, building industry around viable climate action opportunities in Africa. And we focus on a continuum of identifying, working with decision makers to identify those opportunities, quantify them, and being able to prioritize and ultimately realize these opportunities as also engines for economic growth and job creation within the continent. So we have an interest in being able to find viability in the solutions that the world is seeking from a climate standpoint, but then also that feeding into the development agenda of African countries. Of course, the Cash Coalition consists of various organizations cutting across jurisdictions in the global south. We have a focus in Africa, but the same sort of challenges, the same issues that you'll find perhaps in Latin America will be replicated within the continent. And CAPE, as a system builder, a system orchestrator, as a field builder, is seeking to find what are these solutions? What are these solutions that enable the competitive advantages, the comparative advantages that the continent of Africa provides in a way that it can be able to apply itself in an active way towards providing a solution. That is not the predominant narrative that you find in a lot of this conversation today. A lot of times, the continent of Africa, the global south, is viewed more or less as victims, as Willie was mentioning, of the climate crisis. And the role they play in that is, well, let's figure out how we can be able to keep you whole, how we can enable you to deal with the consequences of the climate catastrophe in a way that we can buy ourselves time to figure out the solution. We're here to submit to you as a Cash Coalition, as CAP-A, that no, the Global South can play more of an active and valued contribution, and by extension, the smallholder farmers, who constitute the bulk majority of the populations in these countries. And they can do this in a way that not only addresses the climate crisis, but it unlocks the vast economic transformative opportunity for them, so that now they're no longer bystanders in the fight against climate change, but they're valued and active contributors. And this is an opportunity we feel very strongly about, because we cannot think of what that other opportunity that would enable them to experience and be able to improve their livelihoods and have the kind of impact that this could be able to unleash. And so we are very focused on seeing how we can be able to see this to its logical conclusion and bring smallholder farmers into the equation for what the world is seeking in solving this crisis.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Debbie, I'm now going to ask both you to describe a little bit of what you do, but perhaps in it, because you've been in these conversations over the last 3 days, begin to sort of give us some hints as to the directionally where some of the solutions lie that you've been contemplating as a coalition.
Yeah, so I'm co-founder of Proximity Designs, and we're a social enterprise, or design company really, working in Myanmar for the last 19 years. There are about 30 million people, rural people, who earn their living by farming small plots of land in Myanmar, and they earn about $2 a day. And so as a design company, we basically have huge constraints in designing affordable, extremely affordable and innovative products under these constraints that will boost their incomes and make them more productive on the farm. And so this kind of small farm products that we have designed are small plot irrigation systems like drip, mister systems, foot pumps, and so these are all water saving, as well as now we're moving into biological inputs, biological fertilizers and biostimulants, as well as pest and disease prevention products and services. And so these are what farmers are struggling with on a day-to-day basis. And more we're seeing that they're dealing with the effects of severe climate events, weather events like drought and flooding, and increased pest and disease, soil degradation, all related to climate change. So they're really on the front lines of climate change, and yet extremely vulnerable. Being a farmer is risky enough as it is, with 1,000 decisions to make, and yet on top of that, having to face these insurmountable odds that come with these weather events. And so what we've done over the 19 years is create and design and deliver these kinds of innovative, affordable products that will help them double their incomes. And now more and more we're focusing on products that do both, help farmers as well as the planet and the soil systems and water saving. And so basically it's a win-win that we can help reduce rural poverty as well as take care of the ecological systems that underpin, our lives. And a lot of these farmers in Myanmar as well as other countries, very poor countries, they're growing food for 80% of the population, 90% of the population, and yet they themselves don't have the resources and are starved and don't have enough to put on the table. So, I mean, that is just morally unacceptable. And so, and the other piece is for us, as part of this coalition, so we've helped over 2 million farmers over the 19 years, and we continue to design and innovate as there are more and more constraints, that they face. But for us, we see Myanmar as a sort of extreme lab, that if we can innovate and find practical solutions that work on the ground for farmers, I think with this climate conversation globally, agreements have been made, people sign up, negotiations all done at the high levels, but the question is always, what's next? What really works on the ground? And how do we scale it, and how do we roll it out across the globe? And so what we can contribute is the innovations we've had over the 19 years with smallholder farmers. And I think for us, the big difference is that we see smallholder farmers as cultural emblems, or they're really a significant part of the fabric of the rural community, and they're intimately tied and connected, a sense of connection and tied to the deep ties to the lands. And so, they should be financially recognized and affirmed for the important role they play as caretakers and stewards of these very, very critical planetary resources.
Thank you. Go ahead, applaud, definitely. Okay, so we have a hint at a solution: innovative product design, designed to solve problems of smallholder farmers, increase their productivity, crop yields, water use, scaling that, delivering it to them, making them more affordable. That's definitely something that we're going to return to. Chris, tell us a little bit about Landesa and your work.
Great, thank you, Paul. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. So my organization, Landesa, got its start premised on three basic things that we know about most of the world's poor, most of the people living in poverty today. First, that they still live in rural areas. Second, that they live off the land. That's their main asset. And third, that they don't have secure title to that land. So in rural Africa, less than 10% of the land has been documented. For indigenous peoples who occupy and manage roughly half of the world's forests, only 10% have been given title to those, or some kind of secure and collective rights to those forests. And why does that matter? Well, if you don't feel secure about your rights to your land, it's hard to invest for the long term. For women, this is a particular problem because in most of the countries in the global south, women either by law or custom are discriminated against and don't have the same rights to the land. So if a woman, who are most of the world's smallholder farmers, if a woman improves her land, it can be taken away very easily by a male relative or a rich neighbor, which creates this perverse disincentive to invest for the longer term. And this is a challenge for smallholder farmers all around the world. You can imagine if you are occupying a property and you don't know if you're going to own it 5 or 10 years into the future, it's tough to make those investments, and that's exactly what we found. And as farmers are given more security around their land rights, we start seeing investment in the land go up, productivity, livelihoods. If women get their names on the title, then we see a whole host of benefits, nutrition and food security for their kids, education. So insecure land rights is at the foundation of a whole raft of development issues, and that's been the issue that Landesa has been working on for about 40 years now, with over 60 governments We work with governments primarily to improve their laws and policies, to make sure that smallholder farmers, women, communities have secure land rights. And why is that relevant to climate change? Well, land is also foundational to long-term stewardship of either the plots that the farmers are occupying or the forests that the communities have. For farmers to invest in irrigation or soil or trees, they may not see the benefits for 5, 10, or 20 years. It's a really hard pitch to those farmers to make those kinds of changes unless they feel secure about their land rights. And same with the communities. We now know through lots of research that where communities have strong collective rights to their forests, deforestation goes down, biodiversity is protected. And so happily, we're starting to finally see the world come around to this. And recently at the COPs on climate and biodiversity, for the first time, Indigenous people and local communities are being put at the front of climate change efforts. And I was intrigued because I think you have a panel coming up soon, Paul, and the title is something like, Are Humans the Biggest Impediment to Climate Change? And I think that sort of reflects this, what's been called fortress conservation, where we just got to clear the people out of the way and save those forests and those environmental areas. And I think what Cash is trying to do is really to flip the switch, that people really have to be at the forefront of protecting their farms, protecting their forests. They are the stewards. We have to invest in them. And Cash is really all about trying to change this narrative of farmers and communities as victims of climate change and rather see them as the vanguard or the protagonists to helping protect the forest and investing in their farmlands. And that's what's so exciting about this coalition. I think we're at the right time. I think the message is going to be well received. And you have a number of groups here that are really committed to this. So it's a privilege to be part of all of that.
Awesome. And as you say, as you go down the sequence of presentations, you begin to see each solution set beginning to be articulated, and the incipient power of a coalition that can, in fact, do this in sync and scale it and roll it out globally. So I think that has a lot of promise. So tell us, Michael, about forest trends.
Yeah, no, I'll just maybe add a few things to what's been said already. And part of it is a little bit of the story of of my career. And so I'm a tropical forester by training. I've worked in Paraguay, Brazil, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, and places like that. And it was surprising and really upsetting to really see that every place in the world that we were working, forests were being cut down and replaced by other things like soybean fields, and cattle ranches and things like that. And it was for somebody who's trained as a forester, forests are like supermarkets of goods and services. They're unbelievable. And yet the reality has been that now they're only valued for, forests in this case, is fiber. And when you think about smallholder farmers, the only value is really the product that they're producing, millet, corn, whatever it is. When we're missing a whole big piece of that equation, which is the ecosystem functions that they are providing and stewarding. That's climate, that's carbon, that's water quality, water quantity, and that's habitat and biodiversity for the diversity that we have on this planet. So for me, one of the things that I try to bring to the Cash Coalition is this idea of let's expand the menu of options where we can bring value to those stewards. So while you are a millet farmer, you're also sequestering carbon in your soil. You might be doing good practices that are conserving water. Those are real values that we need to build into this economic equation if we're going to win. So that's a really important thing, expanding the menu where we think about it. And the other is sort of extending the way we think about it. So most of our colleagues in the coalition really are working with smallholder farmers. And I go, well, we work with local communities and indigenous communities, and they face the same exact problems. They are your brothers and your sisters in this. Let us figure out a way to bridge those communities so we can be more powerful as a voice. So I think part of what we bring to the Coalition of Forest Trends, and also what Chris and Landesa bring, is that sense that the coalition we're building is broader than any one group that has historically been there. And I think that's going to allow us to get to the places we need to go. As Chris said, I've been working in this in this space for a long, long time, but I think our moment has finally come. I think the world knows that nature plays a critical role when we think about climate solutions, and that local communities are those, frontline first responders, as the nurses were when we were thinking about COVID. This is what Indigenous local communities and small farmers do when we think about the climate challenge. So I think the question isn't, is carbon good? The question is, how do we make carbon great for smallholders? Because these ecosystem functions are going to maintain our planet.
How do we make carbon great again? Okay, so we're going to use that as the tagline for Cash. Like Willie's already got that written down on a T-shirt or a hat, I'm sure. Okay, so let's now draw ourselves back for a moment. If 1.7% of available cash is going to an area where, as you've all articulated, as Willie said at the start, you have all these incredible social benefits that smallholder farmers and forest dwellers and Indigenous people are producing. Capital can be dumb. Capital can miss an opportunity. But in general, capital tends to go where it can produce a return. So there must be something about this sector, and we've begun to hint at it, that makes it not amenable to flows of capital in traditional ways. And I suspect that if Debbie's work were to be scaled up and rolled out, that every small-scale farmer were to have the most cutting-edge, innovative products designed for their needs, not invented in California, but based on the principle of proximity. If every person were to get Landesa's services, that you were to get title to your property, if Indigenous people were to be made aware of the full value of what's sitting around them and were to be given access to technologies to understand the full value chain, not just a slice of it. And if you were to scale up through CAPE that from a continental perspective and take your field building exercise and move it across to Latin America and other regions, we'd make a lot of progress. But I suspect we will only have solved a portion of the problem that we haven't perhaps discussed, and that is that these are disaggregated, hard to bank, difficult to scale, hard to roll up into some easy whiz-bang investable product, people and communities. And you're all going to say, no, you're totally wrong. There's loads of ways to do that, and we spent the last 3 days discussing exactly how to do precisely that. But I'd love you to sort of articulate some of the ways in which that can be solved and addressed. You want to take a first crack, and then we'll move?
Happy to, Paul. I think we come at this as a coalition with an opportunity lens. And because with any investment opportunity, there's a risk associated with it. And for you to make a decision on whether it's worth jumping in or walking and not considering that opportunity, it will be driven by not the risk really, but risk compared to what are you getting out of it. The return that will drive you to want to feel that the risk that is presented can be overcome because of the compelling nature of what you can get out of this. As a coalition, we feel strongly that the value of smallholder farmers has not been clearly articulated. The value that they bring to the table has only been half told, if not, much less than that, in a way that it can incentivize the kind of investments that need to follow. We feel you can harness the power of smallholder farmers as climate entrepreneurs in a way that the services they provide to not just addressing food security, to not just addressing livelihoods, to not just addressing ecosystem services, to not just addressing issues around water. If we can be able to critically examine what the smallholder farmers contribute, the value they bring in through their efforts, largely unmonetized today, then we'll find reason to see a business case, to see a business model that could be constructed out of engagement with these smallholder farmers, and a return in that business model that then allows them to now no longer be on the sidelines of a lot of the work that is needed or a lot of the contribution they can make. And as a coalition, what we are focused on is being able to showcase to the rest of the world that smallholder farmers and the effort that they have put in the many years that they have been tilling their land, in the many years that they have been putting in their effort, has largely gone unnoticed and monetized. And let's be able to crystallize what that looks like. Let's be able to show, in the absence of these smallholder farmers, what the alternative could have been, and allow that they can feel and benefit from the full benefit of that input, and in return, start attracting the kind of capital that is currently lacking.
So let me build on that and perhaps sharpen my question. I think everything you articulated, you have me at hello, and I agree that all of the climate, planetary, and social value that smallholder farmers bring is undervalued. It's undervalued in social and planetary and ecological terms. The question is, can it be monetized in ways that cause capital to flow that produce investment level returns? And you may say, no, there's a valley of death we have to go through. We need blended models, we need subsidies, we need to think of all these innovative finance mechanisms. I suspect that's what you're going to come to. But what are the ways in which we're going to move from theoretically this is all valuable to capital is going to start flowing?
Just a quick word, because I know Michael's going to talk on the nuts and bolts of disrupting carbon markets, but just at a higher level. We now know that the most cost-effective way to prevent forest degradation and to start restoring our forests and mangroves is by giving those communities secure rights to that land. And Landesa is working with a number of governments throughout Southeast Asia on exactly that. And it's just about changing the laws so that the communities can then start planning. They get certified to protect the forest. It's in their interest. They start restoring the mangroves. It's a no-brainer in many ways. And there's so much money now flowing into this area. The problem in the past has been that a tiny fraction has actually reached those communities. And so one of the things we're hoping that we can do is unlock some of that funding so that it goes past the intermediaries and reaches the communities directly. But Michael can talk more about the carbon markets, but I think that's one sliver of it. There's also a host of other sources of financing for climate change that will start to reach these communities.
Michael, you want to talk about the carbon markets?
Yeah, well, I don't want to just focus on the carbon markets, and that's certainly not what we do at Forest Trends. We think about these emerging environmental markets. So it's water markets, it's biodiversity markets, and it's payments and incentives, the whole suite of things that we know how to deploy when we're talking about sugarcane or corn or all those things. We have those incentives historically built in. We just need to move from products to services, global services that are being provided. And what Chris is saying is so right, that the first step in this is you've got to establish that people have rights to these. But the second step is you've got to give them access to those resources. So the rights can be translated into benefit that can help these communities continue to stay on the land and do what they want to do. So you think about the carbon market, and there's been a lot of kerfuffle around the carbon market this last 6 months or so. But a part of it is that we who have been involved in the design of the carbon markets, sitting in Geneva or in London, are completely out of touch with the folks on the ground that are actually the people that are doing the work, right? When you think about who's protecting us from those forest fires, who's improving soils through good practices. Those are local farmers, Those are indigenous communities. They're not involved in the design of these mechanisms. So we just have to flip it around. And I think that's what we're going to try to do with the Cash Coalition. Let's think about building instruments that are serving those that are providing these services to us as a global society. Let's start there rather than trying to figure out a way to make sure that, you know, it meets this standard and that standard and that standard. So by the time you've got this thing out there, nobody can play in that game, particularly people that are sitting in these remote rural areas. So I think flipping that equation and starting to think about building instruments that really are responding to the needs of those that are providing these services. That's the change.
Jack, I sense you want to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to complement what Michael is sharing, and obviously part of what Chris highlighted. There is obviously presently, as we think about these future instruments, there is the present mechanisms that as a coalition we're considering, you know, one of those being carbon markets, even with all its flaws as currently constituted. And part of the work we're doing is in thinking through how do the markets need to function to be relevant for what the smallholder farmers need. Some work that CAPE is undertaking, for instance, is to think through if the market was to provide a particular price point, you know, let's undertake a price discovery process to see if the markets were to pay for a bundle of interventions, climate smart interventions that smallholder farmers are adopting, and the markets were able to pay us a particular price point, how does that translate in terms of uptake? And using that as a demonstration of, were you to pay then smallholder farmers, say X price per, you know, per ton of carbon for the interventions they're adopting, it can translate into not just obviously the benefit to them from a livelihoods perspective, but then you think about the hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers now being activated as part of a solution towards what, again, we are seeking in terms of the crisis.
So can I want to ask the question, because there's both online and in the audience, there'll be a group of people who are kind of in the weeds on this. So I wanted to sort of ask a question which kind of gets to at least one of the questions. Is your theory that the price that we currently pay per ton of carbon is too low for even all the interventions that you can bring to smallholder farmers to be able to deliver, and therefore we have to think about how you reimagine, supplement, subsidize that market for a period of time in order to kind of kickstart but also get through this rather existential moment, because every ton of carbon avoided now is more valuable than one avoided in the future. So there's some value in that. Or is it that you can give people land rights, give people a whole set of productivity enhancements, and what farmers will start doing is drawing down carbon at much higher and more efficient levels, such that the current price becomes something that they can finance their work at? Or is it a combination of those two things? Because, you know, one is about addressing the market as it currently exists and trying to reinvent or subsidize it, and one is just to say the market's fine, we just need to get people who have barriers to skills, access, and technology and capital potential to be market ready and compete in that market. And is that a helpful framing of the question?
Well, I think both are true, but the real truth is when you think about the price of carbon, price is a reflection of value, right? And I think we've got that completely wrong. And we're off by an order of magnitude. So it's not close. It's not like $4 to $6 to $10. We're way off. And so that has to shift. And the way that shifts, I think, is when, you know, really risk. We put value on things as long as the more value we put on, the more risk we have involved in losing them. So water, on, you know, fresh water. We are running out of water on this planet. And finally, people are starting to wake up about that. And so that unfortunately is what forces us to start to think about adding the value, and then with that value, we can think about pricing it correctly. So I think we're in that same, you know, in a very slow motion way, we're in that same channel when we think about climate and carbon emissions, right? If only Al Gore had won 25 years ago, we would be in a way different place. But we are so behind the 8 ball in terms of emissions reductions that we need to do. So that is driving this change, and we're seeing the risk and the scarcity around this, and that's going to drive the value up. But the prices have to be $40 a ton, not $4 a ton. But along with that, you're exactly right, that we're creating new marketplaces, right? We're talking about new sectors, and we're talking about people that have historically not been a part of markets in the past. So how do we make sure that they're equipped to be able to enter and engage with them, not only to sit down at the bottom of that food chain and benefit, but to be designers of the instruments that are going to get the resources to where they need to go. So those are two things that have to happen at once, and they have to happen pretty darn quickly, frankly.
Paul, if I can just also address, because I think this is one of the critical advantages of the coalition, is that the reason that carbon markets get such a bad name is at least twofold. One is they've lacked integrity. So a lot of the claims that were made by project developers didn't, in fact, benefit the climate in any way. And secondly, because so little money eventually ends up in the pockets of the people on the ground because of the large chunks taken out by intermediaries. And this coalition is aimed at, first, we work with these farmers, we work with these communities, we can provide the integrity to back up the claims that we're making, and we can also do a lot about the chain to ensure that more of the percentage of the funding arrives at the farmers. So yes, we need to address the price of carbon, but we also have to make sure that much more of that, whatever the price is, ends up in the hands of the farmers.
I just wanted to add that besides the undervaluation, I think the costs of not doing so are mounting in terms of biodiversity loss, and soil is a finite resource, and all these resources, and the costs of human suffering and migration and refugees is growing due to climate change. So, I mean, those are really high costs associated monetarily that need to be factored in.
So I was going to come to you, Debbie, in this follow-up question. So let's take Chris's point about integrity, Michael's point about pricing. Let's presume we live in a utopia that the Cash Coalition has helped fashion, which is we get the integrity part of carbon markets right, and the price rises to reflect both risk and scarcity, both because scarcity is going to happen to us, but also perhaps benevolent governments start attaching through regulation and taxes proper prices on carbon, and certain forms of conduct that have been, frankly, should have been prohibited start becoming prohibited. So we start drifting up from 4 to 40 to 100. Now all of a sudden, in 5 or 7 years' time, hopefully we get there quicker, we start having a proper price on carbon. Between now and then, we have a problem. And if I come now to Proximity's work, right, if we're only getting $4 or $5 a ton right now, and you have a whole slew of extraordinary farmers in Myanmar who could be doing bamboo plantations, which could be drawing down gigatons of carbon if you could grow them and scale them, but you can't finance it right now through the current carbon markets. We need to find some bridging mechanism to do it, right? And I'm sure you guys spent a lot of time thinking about what those bridges are. So what's just give us a couple of ideas, I mean, from your own lived experience, but from your conversations, what might that bridge look like, and how's that bridge affordable, and who's going to pay for it?
Well, right now, because of the super constrained environment of Myanmar, it's sort of, donors see it as a house on fire, and who wants to invest in that politically, But I think for us, we've had scarce donor money that has subsidized the our R&D work and innovation, and helping roll out these important products and services. And we've had to design in a way that, without subsidies, I mean, except for the R&D part and the marketing, that that these products and services pay for themselves. And they're super affordable, and farmers pay for it, and it's profitable for them, and they get immediate return in one season. So we've had to design with those severe constraints that it's not highly subsidized at all. In that sense, we're an extreme lab. But it has been donor grants that have subsidized our R&D work. But more than that, though, I mean, I think there's a huge need for other kinds of financing.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think part of the conversations that we've been having is to think of how do we focus on beyond carbon. How do these projects become compelling to some of the ideas that you've had from the panel, the water benefits, the biodiversity benefits, and how that translates into a compelling case that carbon just comes in sort of icing on the cake. And we discussed that if you think of, for those who may have sold cupcakes, icing is as important as anything in that cupcake. But then you are able to still have the base of it in a way that there is a case to be made, even as we figure out solutions and reforms to the carbon markets, that there is importance to be able to focus on these solutions, to bring these projects in a way that still compelling enough as we work on the changes, the reforms that the markets need to be able to be relevant. I wanted to just add one more item to the list that Chris had shared. Part of the methodologies that enable these projects to get to market are not informed by the realities in the parts of the world that we work in. And we need to make sure that these methodologies that are developed to bring these projects to the market, carbon projects to the market, are reflective of the practices that we know to be uniquely Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and perhaps not reflective of some of the Western thinking that might inform the formation of this methodology, because that's part of the barriers that come in the way of these projects obviously being able to get to the point of a sale and generating the benefit that they can for these farmers.
Paul, maybe just one quick thought here. If we were here 40 years earlier and talking about renewable energy, it would be the same conversation, right? And everybody goes, like, how are we going to get there? And what happened was that we had big, heavy subsidies from governments, from everything that did this. And I think there's some good news when you look across the globe, a little bit of good news in all of the darkness. But part of those are things like, the new government in Brazil, the Lula government. And, we'll see how it all plays out. It's a really complicated country with a lot of different kind of currents going on, but they have elevated people to the ministry level that are really partners in this with us. And they've created something called a subsecretariat around bioeconomy. And so this is like a really different way of thinking about economic development for the Amazon. Instead of let's cut down the Amazon, let's put cattle in there, let's put soybeans in there, something that's productive in their minds. And let's have a countercurrent to that, which are all of the kind of the supply chains that are forest-based. So it's the Brazil nuts that we eat, and it's the cacao that we eat, and it's the acai bowls that we love. Those are forest-based products. And if we can kind of charge them, then we create a countercurrent, which is the bioeconomy, which delivers this kind of thing. And so if you think about smallholders, and one of our colleagues in the coalition works in central Nigeria with maize, and the idea would be if they're doing these great leading edge practices, which are delivering all these additional benefits, that corn should have that value embedded in it. So when you guys go out and buy whatever we buy, let's keep our eyes open for that opportunity to be a signal that we're ready for that change.
I want to take your point around what happened with renewable energy 40 years ago and extend that analogy into what you're trying to deal with. Because if I think about renewables for a moment, I go, well, 40 years ago, highly inefficient, the production and the scaling of the technologies themselves was sub-economic. And then technology has come in, which enables each of those wind turbines and those solar panels to operate in much more efficient ways. And then we get all the other collateral benefits. We build smart grids, we attach them to batteries and storage technologies, we attach to e-mobility, we start digitizing our flow of electricity. There's lots of things that emerge from that. I go, okay, I'm totally banking on that. I'm going to pay that. And when I'm going to invest in that, it's also kind of CapEx heavy, it's human light. I can set up a company, I can draw down cash from it. That's really easy. So I like the idea of subsidizing it, and I like where we've got to today, and now you don't even need subsidies. In fact, it's beating everything else. You guys are working on something which I think is way more valuable because you're putting people first, but because you have those darn pesky things called people in the middle of it, it's also harder, right? Because that analogy that you set out, I buy morally, but actually there's some parts about what you're doing which are more complex than the solar renewable model. So tell us what your 40-year subsidy program would look like that gets us, hopefully not 40 years from now, but 10 years from now, because we need it.
7 years.
7 years from now? Oh, you've already got the answer, okay. So discuss.
Well, I'd be curious to hear, Jack, your perspective too, but what I would think about is, again, when we go back 40 years, you know, it was a struggling sector with, like you say, very inefficient, a lot of inefficiency in it. And what turned that around were subsidies. So it was like the Department of Defense that said, we need to invest in this. And so we need those we need that leadership. And it could be, again, the Department of Defense or something. These are strategic interests for our countries to be able to have a supply of water, to be able to make sure that our cities aren't flooded. All of these things are strategic, interests that we as governments, whether it's the U.S., whether it's Kenya, need to embrace to say, yeah, and so therefore we need to lay down the track right now as that sector evolves. Because you're right, it's much messier. It's not just the people that are running around that are complicated, and they are, but it's the systems we're trying to understand, these complex biological systems that we're like learning every day something new. So we have to have that fuel to be able to continue down that journey and keep learning.
I'll just add quickly, Paul, because I would agree with all of that, but I think part of this is just that the priorities of donors and philanthropists and governments who have been subsidizing things have been misguided. And there's always that search for a silver bullet, some new technological fix, or we'll just create parks and that'll save the day. I think just flipping that script to make sure that now the money actually goes to organizations that work closely with smallholder farmers, and there's a host of them here in this coalition, but there are organizations all around the world that know how to work with farmers and know how to help them adapt to new technologies. There are certain market interventions that we need to make that are fairly modest, but we need funding for that. And the same with communities that are becoming the stewards of their forests. We know how to do that. We need to just make sure that the money now, which has just been a tiny fraction to date, starts to arrive in slightly bigger amounts. But that's a shift in mentality initially of the donors. The markets then can follow. But initially, we need the donor community, we need governments to start investing in organizations that are working at the grassroots.
I guess, yeah, I would just add that I think the other unknown, but scientists would all agree that it's going to happen and they don't know, is the tipping points, that we can't predict in these ecological systems. It's so complex and interrelated, and there's so many shocks happening climate-wise all over the globe that they say they cannot predict when the next breakdown will be or tipping point will be. And I think that's a big risk, huge risk for everybody.
Yeah, I think I will only add that we have set these climate goals as a global community of where we need to be for net zero targets, to be able to decarbonize. And if we were to believe that's the case, if we were to take what we have set in front of ourselves as targets of what we need to be doing to reach certain milestones by 2030, by 2050. Then the question becomes, what are the most cost-effective ways for us to get there? There's a menu of options. And part of what the coalition is advancing is that there's an option that is not getting the consideration it needs to get. It's not getting the attention it needs to get in terms of smallholder farmers being part of this solution. And we're talking of hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers. Now, how does that compare with some of the solutions that are being put forward in terms of cost effectiveness? How does that compare in terms of impact? How does that compare in terms of a multiplicity of problems, challenges being solved? Because the moment you deploy smallholder farmers, this is not just addressing climate. It's addressing a slew of various other interventions that as a global community, we are seeking for solutions for. And if you factor in that long list of benefits that would accrue from this, there's the term that is used, core benefits, and we like to think of core benefits as core, as part and parcel of what this will deliver, then we argue that is a no-brainer what option not only helps us in getting there quicker, but also solves for a number of different other global challenges that we're grappling with.
So I'm going to now begin to turn over to the audience. What I'd love, both in the conversation, because there are also people, Cash Coalition members in the audience as well, but it would be, I think, useful schematically by the end of this conversation to be able to answer, at least back of the envelope for a novice, this question. If we're going to raise $1 billion a year over the next 7 years to support the Cash Coalition, if we said that's what you guys achieved by doing this, you'd all be, that's worthwhile setting up this coalition. And then you would say, here's my shopping list against that to accelerate us to the world that Michael set forth, which is now small-scale farmers are like the renewables in the world. They don't need to hold their hands and pat them on the heads. They're ready to go. They scale. They're just ready. And carbon prices have got to a point where what they do, they're being paid hand over fist for what they do. What is your shopping list like? Throw out some of your shopping list. So we've said, give them technology and designs and give them appropriate implements. Give them land title. Make sure that they do regenerative, circular agricultural practices where they value the forests appropriately. Think about what Root Capital does in terms of low-interest loans that are be able to be made on non-usurious terms, right? Your shopping list. What's your shopping list? Because I think that makes it practical for everybody's minds. And then how that then accelerates to an investable ecosystem becomes what I think becomes your goal and what we all aspire to.
Are you going to throw that out to the audience, or?
Well, why don't you do some quick-fire things I haven't said rapidly, and then A, questions, and B, stuff from the audience, because things I haven't said, we haven't discussed.
Off the top of my head, I would say create a financing mechanism that now unlocks an opportunity to access funding that is currently not available for what the smallholder farmers need.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about building a portfolio and doing it a little bit differently. So instead of the investor saying, okay, this is the money that I have and these are requirements, you go back to, okay, these are the resources that I am stewarding for the global community. This is how I need to have this money get to me, this compensation. So you use the instruments that we have in the financial world, but you turn them around starting from the beneficiary, the person that's delivering the benefit to the society. And we could do and that's what we're talking about. Can we build a portfolio? And around that portfolio, you think about a capacity building wave that we are creating. So like you say, 10 years from now, we won't need this stuff anymore because the local communities, the farmers will have the means and the knowledge to be able to navigate climate finance and benefit from it.
I would say also that cash is hopefully going to become a political force. And we need to change the narrative. We need to be a global actor. We need to change the attitudes of some donors and governments. And so that's advocacy. and education. And I would invest in that as well. And I think that's the benefit of having a broad coalition with a certain amount of reputational capital.
And I think just the process of monitoring, reporting, and verification needs to work for farmers rather than be so complicated and so costly.
Okay, over to you. Here comes the mic.
I've got quite a loud voice. So many nice
But it's also online, so
Oh, okay,
you don't
yes,
have to be
of course.
loud.
Okay, I shall be quiet. Hi, I'm Bushra, so I work for Empower Impact Limited, and at the moment we're actually creating a platform which is connecting social entrepreneurs and community changers with international businesses. And part of this is through sponsorship programs, and the change makers can then coordinate other people on the ground. They themselves are there completely. I've got so many questions. It's been so stimulating, super interesting listening to you guys. So there is funding, but it's not getting to the right people in the right way. There's some, institutional blockers. There's sort of local blockers, and also there's this kind of we don't really know how to help those people. They know better. So I feel like decolonization goes with decarbonization. And this is the zeitgeist at the moment. And it's the only way it's going to move forward. So we, with our platform, not trying to sell the platform, but it does try and facilitate that. And I was just thinking, inspired by what you were saying, that if you have sort of access to the community changers and the group they coordinate, you can test some of those financial instruments and employ them as a resource to say, well, this is what we've been doing. How has it not been working? That product market fit, but for those carbon instruments, but going through a particular, like you said, the farmers are so busy themselves, but if they have the coordinator from there, that could be a way.
I'm going to take 3 and then we'll come back to you at the back.
Hi, thanks for the conversation. My name's Joanna Yo. I have a background in capital markets and technology. My question for the coalition actually is there any work being done to collect data in a way that is systematic and consistent across, both the kinds of data, like the digital footprints you're collecting around the farmers, but then also any work that's being done around carbon? Because my view is, capital markets respond to data, right? Part of the issue with getting capital in is people don't know what the risk-reward profile is. They don't know what that looks like. And definitely you need diversification, you need portfolio construction, but you need to start somewhere. And so I'm wondering, what kind of work is being done across the coalition around some of this, because we're doing some work in India and Indonesia, and one of the benefits in those economies is there is a lot of digitization that's happening, and with that comes some level of standardization of the types of information that we're able to collect at scale from this type of group. So I guess the question is, are there plans to start working on some of these standardized metrics and like data collection processes? Because that is actually quite transformative. And then one kind of example I'll share from this part of the world. So I'm visiting from Singapore, but in Indonesia, actually the IFC, and you guys probably may have come across this, they did a very, very interesting project on the ground with 43,000 smallholder farmers that are sort of outsourced suppliers to a plantation that sells to some of the largest buyers in the world. And what they were responding to was these large buyers were coming to the plantations and saying, we need sustainable palm oil. But by the time it was getting to the smallholders on the ground, 4 or 5 layer down the middlemen, those guys were not getting access to tools or resources or financing to make that transition. So where the IFC came in to do a really interesting project was to say, let's go in, provide the technical assistance and the tools. While they are doing that, they started collecting data that would allow them to then claim carbon credits for the farmers. And they did that to then pay for what they were helping the farmers make the transition for. And so I guess, it's sort of an example, and just so curious if this is part of the agenda for the coalition.
Amazing. We're going to Julian, and then we're going to go back to the panel.
Hello, I'm Julian Asher, and I'm an angel investor, but I also run an ecotourism company that works in Africa. And I guess my question is, I've spent a lot of time in rural Africa, and I know that one of the challenges there is that there's a lot of wastage and leakage between the farmer and the market. And you sort of think that would be one of the low-hanging fruit in terms of being able to increase the amount of income that farmers get and to be able to sort of enable them to do better from their labor. And the other challenge is that oftentimes the buyers, particularly in extremely rural areas, you're either looking at getting stuff into a city, which then has that leakage, or you're looking at, say, your local ecotourism lodge or something. But I've spoken to a bunch of the guys who run the lodges, and one of their issues is that they would love to source locally, but they have issues with consistency of supply. And the problem is if you're buying for, say, 70 lodges, you need to know that you're going to get the right amount of beans or whatever it is that you need. So how do we address those things? Because that would be more efficient than trying to get it into a market in a city, but then we also need to find a way to basically enable the buyers to buy in the way that in the quantity that they would like to.
Awesome. Any of you, and
Maybe just
try and show your pearls of wisdom in 60-second bites.
Yeah, no, just the point you brought up in the back there, and you need to come and work with all of us, right? For starters, that's the kind of experience that is going to be really valuable if we're going to be able to scale up this work. But you're so right, and as you probably know, when you think about emerging markets, information is king. So to be able to have what you were saying is critical, and that is one of the things that we're talking about at the Cash Coalition, is can we start to aggregate across these different organizations, working with different kinds of communities, this kind of information so we can talk about 10 million small farmers and indigenous communities, or 50 million, and really start to send a signal that this is a big deal. But information is important, and I think your point is the same thing. These are markets that need infrastructure. It's the same thing with your point. You can't have a random act of conservation. You've got to figure out how you build the infrastructure. So those ecotourism lodges and those rural areas, marketplaces, are pulling in these products that are better products, that are embedded with water and biodiversity and carbon value. But it's infrastructure. We need to build the infrastructure for this thing.
Yeah, and what I'll add to that, I think tying again what Michael has shared between Joanne's and Julian's question is information asymmetry. I think beyond aggregation, where there's multiplicity of farmers at a small scale, and the demand that you have to meet is obviously at a scale where you have to bring in a number of them, and the infrastructure and the platform to do that doesn't exist. It's just that there's no visibility, for instance, in terms of pricing. Even as a farmer in some corner of the country trying to sell whatever limited produce that they have, it's very opaque what the market offering is, because a lot of this information is not available to them in a way that even with that limited sort of produce, at least you can have a sense of, if I'm getting $1 per ton, how does that compare with what the ultimate market will potentially look like? So I think, yes, there's a number of different things that obviously need to be factored into solving for this. And, it can feel overwhelming when you think about what needs to be done. And what we have chosen to do is come at this again from an opportunity lens standpoint, understanding if you can, when you do get to where these farmers potentially can feel the impact and the transformative opportunity that this presents for them, then it enables you to think about what is that we need to be considering as a solution. You'll not solve everything at the same time, but they're things that will enable you to get closer to where you need to and create the momentum and groundswell that allows now others to join in this journey in driving towards ultimately how these farmers then become, active contributors.
Please. Mike, could you...
Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting discussion. My brain's going into a bit of overdrive. I just wanted to push back on that renewable energy analogy, specifically because I think the people and the human element that you're very much focused on was actually, to me at least, seems like it was kind of always missing from the renewable energy discussion. If you think of solar energy, you're loath to kind of criticize the renewable energy market because its mission is very important, but solar energy, a lot of the polysilicon production comes from Xinjiang, so kind of human rights, forced labor issues, lithium mining in Chile for e-mobility, kind of electric cars, potential huge detrimental impacts for local communities, indigenous communities there, just as two examples. So I love the focus. I wonder, and the coalition is obviously full of really impressive people, but how... I still feel that there might be the voice missing of the actual smallholder farmer as part of the discussion. Maybe I'm wrong to kind of criticize that, but is there plans to involve leaders of kind of specific indigenous communities or actual smallholder farmers with that real life experience as part of this discussion? And I'm not trying to be critical because obviously I think the mission is great.
Great question. Great question. I'm certain they're going to have 400 compelling answers to that one, but off you go. But please, and we'll cluster 2 or 3 and then come back. Yeah.
Hello, Stephen. I'm a British organic farmer and agroforester. I was just wondering if the panel are completely sold on the principle of offsetting and credits. Secondly, is the issue or principle of additionality at smallholding level an issue? And in what practical ways are you looking at aggregating the impacts of so many scattered and smallholding in these parts of the world?
Awesome. Then the third one over here, and then we'll...
Hi, Yasmin from Impatience Earth. I really like the idea of making voluntary carbon markets work for actual communities and stewards of nature. I'm just wondering if you've thought about the other side of that equation, which is who is buying those carbon credits, and does that help actually enable business practices that undermine that?
Awesome. Go to it. All quick, easy, unmorally complicated questions.
Yeah, no, really.
Very Conduit discussion group.
So maybe just a couple of thoughts. You're exactly right. When we think about the carbon marketplace, we think about integrity. It's not just from the producer of the carbon credit. It's not just the integrity of the producer that's growing forests and making sure that what he's doing or she's doing is there, but it's the buyer, the integrity of the buyer. And so what we have always been promoting is that we need to look at both sides of that equation, and to be, it should be like a privilege to be able to enter into this marketplace on the buy side. And what you should demonstrate is that you as a business or whatever, or as an individual or a government are already doing everything you can do to minimize your impact before you use this instrument like an offset, which is responding a little bit to your question. But the truth is we don't have much time, right? The scientists are telling us we have 7 years to make a difference. So we got to throw the kitchen sink at this. And a lot of, the debate around offsetting is, oh, well, maybe it's bogus, they're not doing the right thing. Again, if we can demonstrate the integrity on the buyer's side, that's going to strengthen that instrument. But we need to do it all. We need to have everything we can on the table if we're going to be able to achieve what we need to achieve in the next 7 years.
Debbie.
On the smallholder farmer voice and participation, I mean, our design, we use human-centered design processes, and so that's about, we've been co-creating with farmers iteratively all along, and prototyping and slowly, so they're very much integrated in our design process, and that's how we've been operating. But we do have many member organizations here, Mafisa from Zambia, and Komako, and One Acre Fund, who, like us, have direct relationships with farmers for decades. And right now we are also in the midst of doing a farmer voice report to survey to basically capture, directly from farmers, probably from 12 countries represented, how they see their role in mitigating climate change and their role as stewards.
Chris and Jack, any final words? Because Rosie is giving us the shepherd's crook.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Yeah. Just building on what Debbie said, these are all organizations that have survived and thrived because of the fact that we work very closely with the communities and the farmers that we help and represent in some way. And this coalition is really all about trying to elevate the voices of those farmers and those communities so they become part of the solution rather than just objects of these markets that are created in distant places. So that is very much what we're up to or out to do. It's also a group of very pragmatic organizations, and so that we will look for the low-hanging fruits, we will iterate. We won't solve all the problems, but hopefully we will create a wedge and create a bigger discussion about how we value carbon and how we ensure that it delivers real benefits.
Yeah, and riding on the point about pragmatism is, I think, the point in terms of the mechanisms that are available to monetize what the farmers are doing, the efforts the farmers are putting in. At the moment, that's primarily the carbon markets. It doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean it's without flaws, but in terms of just thinking about, at the moment, what is available to enable us to move the ball forward and allow that we can start seeing benefits, not in the future when, perhaps another mechanism is available, but using existing mechanisms, even with existing flaws, by working on those flaws as we go about that, to enable that we start realizing those benefits right away.
So we have scratched the surface. We have tilled around in the topsoil. But you guys have been amazing. It's been a total privilege to have you here for the last couple of days. I think this coalition, if you can support the infrastructure, support the innovation, support the financing, and place smallholder farmers at the center of the entire endeavor, which is what you do, will not just change people's livelihoods, but also accelerate our path to net zero, which is something that we can't do without smallholder farmers. So you're doing civilization's work. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for wildly intelligent questions and challenging and thought-provoking. And the evening's not over. Hang out, have a drink, keep talking. We'll be here and we'll continue to support. But a huge hand of applause to both the panelists, the people in the room, and the people behind this coalition. Thank you.